Hello, everybody. Welcome to the WA2 Take Two talk, as we've been calling it. Thank you very much for attending. I, of course, am Chris Weave. I'm the conference director, and I have with me Chris Carlson, who is the co-designer of Harpoon, a novelist who's written a bunch of stuff with Larry Bond, a former intelligence officer, a retired U.S. Navy officer, a historian, and a proud Minnesotan. Did I miss anything there, Chris?
And a birthday boy.
And a birthday boy, yes. I knew, damn it, that was actually part of the reason why I wanted to do this, is I wanted to wish you a happy birthday on camera. So Chris is a naval analyst by trade, and he is very interested in WA2. I mean, for those of us who saw the Western Approaches Tactical Unit thing last year, you may recall that I talked about how, WA2 is sort of like one of those stories in the wargaming community, right? It's one of those like, how did your people help win the war? Tell us your tale of glory, right? It's up there with DIA finding the Cuban missiles in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Naval War College. Theirs is specifically a wargaming story of, Nimitz saying that we weren't surprised by anything except the kamikaze because we gamed it all on the floors of Newport. And so WA2 is sort of lately, WA2 has achieved a similar sort of larger than life status in the wargaming community. And one of the things that anybody with any experience realizes that once you sort of reach a larger than life status, if you're sort of a professional and you're looking at it, you have a tendency to go, let's pull the thread on that a little bit, because there can be situations where things are tremendously valuable. They were definitely part of the story, but in the retelling, it gets larger and larger and larger. And there is, frankly, nobody better on planet Earth, I think, to go back and examine some of the claims that have been made about WA2 than the speaker today, Chris Carlson. And the thing is that Chris should write a book on this, because it's a huge, huge topic across the board. In this particular case, Chris is going to focus on a particular small part of it, and I'll let him take it over from here.
Okay, thanks, Chris. How this came about is after last Connections Online and the WA2 discussion, I kind of made some questions to Chris and said, there's something not quite right in some of this. To which point he said, you really should do a presentation next year. 15 seconds later, he said, no, you are doing a presentation next year. And being somewhat sagely, I nodded yes. So this is what came out of easily a good hour discussion. We're going to focus on Buttercup and Raspberry. This is really what got WA2 started, analyzing Convoy HD-76 and to figure out what was going on. As a preamble, let's just say, and I echo what Chris said, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit is one of the best examples of how to do wargaming to solve military problems. If you want to see the quintessential exemplar, I'm not going to argue that much on it. I would say that its role as an education institute is arguably its greatest contribution to winning the Battle of the Atlantic. The Roberts, the Wrens, and the other support staff trained on the order of 5,000 escort commanders, most of them Royal Navy reservists, volunteer reservists, their Commonwealth equivalents, and some foreign officers, France, Poland, Norway. None of them had even fundamental basic training in ASW. You've got to have a theoretical basis, or as James Godric would say, a procedural basis, if you're going to make practical training useful. And this is something that WA2 really provided. Now, initially, they weren't the tactical development powerhouse that we understand it to be. It took a little time to develop that because they had to develop this dynamic operational feedback loop, at which point WA2 became this huge communications hub that brought back experiences, that allowed the staff to rechange their training program to really emphasize what was happening as quickly as they could. The problem is the story of Uatu is largely a single-person narrative. We have really two accounts, one by Mark Williams, the other one by Simon Parkin. The problem is their base documentation is the same. It's Gilbert Roberts' unpublished memoirs. Now, between these two books, there are some notable discrepancies. In particular, what raspberry is very different between these two books. And that's what got me to start pulling the thread on this, because the analysis and assumptions that are consistent in both of these books do not match one of the maneuvers. Now, in the process of pulling the thread, there was an unsettling discovery that there's a huge number of historical errors. Not sure where they came from. Were they based in Roberts' memoirs? Did Williams and Parkin just not understand and distorted it? We really don't know. But the biggest and most interesting revelation, in my opinion, was that the popular notion of raspberry that you see on virtually every website, the Wikipedia page that was first put out by Williams, is not raspberry. Now, Sally Davis gave us a little bit of a hint of this in her George Washington University presentation in November 2021. So we all think this is raspberry. It's not. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go a little bit through the two operational maneuvers. I'll walk you through Buttercup as devised by Walker. We'll look at Gilbert Roberts' analysis of Convoy HD-76. And this was the convoy where Walker's group, the 36 escort group, sank 4 U-boats. That had never been done before. It was considered a very highly successful convoy run. We will then look at Roberts' assumptions and tactical basis for Operation Raspberry. And then we're going to see what actually got published in the Atlantic Convoy instructions. Now, here's a spoiler alert. The events that transpired that led through the discussion up through the presentation to Admiral Sir Percy Noble in both the Williams and Parkin's book, I do not believe could have happened. So I'm going to give you an alternative plausible timeline for how Raspberry was actually developed. And then we're going to go back and end with some wargaming lessons that are worth repeating because we see some violations in this development here. So let's talk first about Operation Buttercup. It is a coordinated, multi-ship, 9-time tactical maneuver to counter a U-boat attack. Its goal is to get a surfaced U-boat, which is making an attack, to submerge. Walker's primary purpose was to force the U-boat to give up the advantage of mobility, the advantage of being able to attack, and to improve its chances of being detected, because ASDIC actually had a better chance of finding a U-boat once it's submerged than visual or radar could find a surfaced one. Remember, in this time frame, most of the escorts had the Type 286M radar. This is a long wavelength radar with a fixed antenna. The ship has to basically turn to see anything. It's not well suited to finding a small radar contact like a surfaced U-boat. So Walker's whole approach was that he assumed that a submarine was going to approach a convoy on the surface. So it's a really bad ASDIC target. It's a really bad radar target. It's hard to see. He claimed it was going to be trimmed down. That's debatable. The Germans said you don't really want to do that. It can approach from any bearing, and it's going to be phase of the moon and wind are your really big drivers on that. It can fire anywhere from inside what's called the torpedo danger zone, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. And he even admitted it was possible a U-boat could go inside the convoy, but it would stay on the surface and execute multiple attacks. So what Walker was trying to do was come up with a focused, concentrated search on the most likely avenue of approach or escape. And if you look at this diagram of Buttercup, and oh, by the way, it is my personal belief, this is the first time we've ever seen a full diagram of Buttercup, because Williams and Parkin have a very simplistic and incomplete view of the maneuver, which is common in most secondary published works. All you hear them talk about is that the escorts turn out, they pop a bunch of star shells and other illuminants for 20 minutes, and if they don't see anybody, they head back. That is absolutely incorrect. Yes, the escorts do turn out. They do lob star shells for 20 minutes, but that's only part one of the whole operation. You'll also notice that escort B, contrary to what Roberts keeps on saying, turns inward and actually goes into the convoy, executing a 1 nautical mile square search. The other escorts involved, C and A, do turn out, and as they leave the flank of the convoy, they start bombing with star shells, as does, in this case, escort H. So you've got 4 escorts lobbing star shells looking for a surfaced U-boat. Now, after that 20-minute period, the escorts just don't go back. They turn in, and you have A, H, and C conducting a tight, overlapping ASDIC search. This is cooperative multi-unit searches are the hallmark of Walker-based ASW tactics. He almost never sent a single escort out to try and get a U-boat. Now, Buttercup has some problems. And what those are is the fact that it is a very focused search, and it has to be properly called to the right side. Is it port? Is it starboard? Is it astern? And if you screw that up, and Walker did screw that up in HD 76, it completely negates the counterattack. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, who was then the commander-in-chief of Western Approaches, while complimenting Walker's group on a job well done, had some very strong criticism of Buttercup. And I've provided that from the Admiralty report that came out in January 1942. And he basically says that it should not be on one side. It should be on both sides. Now, what I would read this to mean is this should not be on one side. It should cover the convoy. And it should not be just called out by the senior officer. Anybody should be able to do that. So based on these, and I want you to remember these because these are going to play again in how Roberts does his development. So let's talk about Convoy HD 76. All right, quick summary. This was the first clear-cut victory for the Royal Navy over a U-boat, Wolfpack. The British lost 4 ships. The escort carrier Audacity, which was the former German SS Hanover. They lost this destroyer Stanley, a town class, which means it was an old U.S. It's one of those 50 U.S. destroyers. And they lost 2 merchant ships, Ruckinch and Anavor. The Germans lost a total of 5 U-boats. Now, U-127 was taken out by a hunter-killer group out of Gibraltar, and so it really didn't play. The other 4 were taken out by Walker's 36th Escort Group. Operation Buttercup was employed twice during this convoy battle. And contrary to what Roberts says in his memoirs and what Williams and Parkin pulled out, the first time he did it, it was successful. The second time Walker called Buttercup was after the sinking of the merchant ship Anavor. It was unsuccessful because Walker miscalled it. Now, the convoy battle that we see in the Williams and Parkin books have a lot of factual errors. They are very inconsistent with the official Admiralty report on HD 76. So let's just do a little quick introduction to the convoy. We have 32 merchant ships. They're in 9 columns, spaced 1,000 yards apart. They're in 4 rows, spaced 400 yards apart. Row 4 is incomplete. It has got a lot of open spaces to port, and there's an open space in the center column. These will be important things to remember when we get to the actual engagements. The position, such as 1-1, tells you it's in the first column, first row, and that means it is the most forward port ship. They had 9 escorts with this convoy. You had 2 sloops, one of which was Stork, Walker's flagship, and 7 Flower-class corvettes. They were also supported by 3 Gibraltar-based destroyers and the escort carrier Audacity. Now, 2 of these destroyers would have to leave after the 18th of December for fuel reasons. This convoy was attacked by up to 9 U-boats. It would have been 10, but U-127 got destroyed early on. 6 of these U-boats belonged to the Wolfpack group Seeräuber, and there were 3 reinforcing U-boats once Dönitz figured out just what they were up against in terms of escorts. All right, this is a complete overview of the convoy action from the 14th of December when it left through the 23rd of December when Dönitz called it off. He was done. The things I will point out to you are the red arrows. These mark the engagements where the U-boats were sunk. So on the 17th of December, you have U-131 gets picked up by an aircraft, a Martlet, an F4F3 off Audacity. Walker sends out 5 escorts, and they proceed to pound it. It surfaces and gets sunk by gunfire. The next day, Stanley sees a U-boat approaching the port quarter, and Walker sends out 4 more. They pound it, and then 2 of the destroyers, Blankney and Stanley, sink it with gunfire. There is little debate about these in Robert's book. He mentions them. He mentions that they were redone, but there's really no issue with them. Where we really start to see changes and differences between the Roberts biographies and the Admiralty report is U-574 here, and then what was called a probable kill by Deptford up in here, and later turned out to be U-567. So let's look at December 19th. HMS Stanley sees a U-boat approaching from the port quarter. Walker is informed by radio that there's a U-boat on the surface. That's not good enough. We need to know a little bit more. Stanley starts edging over toward her, largely because her ASDIC is not working right now. Now, I don't know why they got so close, because the U-boat fired a spread of 3 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. Why Stanley let him get that close, I don't know. Stanley was hit by one of these torpedoes, and she sank pretty quickly. The other 2 missed and were seen passing astern of the merchant ship Largo and Stork. Walker calls Buttercup astern. Now, normally, and you can see from the diagram on the right, the aft escort would go into the convoy and start initiating a search. Well, Walker knows the explosion's back aft, so he turns around and heads out. Samphire is the port side corvette. She turns and starts coming down. We don't know who the starboard side corvette is. So you can see Walker comes down, and then once he gets about where Stanley said they initially detected, he swings around. At this point, he's popping star shells like crazy, but he doesn't see the U-boat. The U-boat sees Stork and submerges. And very soon thereafter, Walker has a strong ASDIC contact. He runs over, drops an accurate 10-charge pattern, and U-574 comes to the surface. This is the point where there's a little bit of dancing going on, as they tend to do a whole bunch of circling. But after a while, U-574 is rammed and sinks. Here's the interesting thing about this night's events. They're almost completely missing from the Roberts biographies. You see nothing about the sinking of Stanley, nothing about the sinking of Routledge. In Parkin, you have a vague reference to a U-boat being sunk during this time frame. But most of the information dealing with this is not present. Now, where Roberts really spends most of his time is on the attack on the 21st, where the merchant ship Enivor in the 5-3 position is torpedoed. Most of the people that reported it strongly suggest it was on her port side. Walker calls Buttercup starboard. He would later say that that was an error. He should have called it astern, had he realized it was the aftmost ship of the center column. And this is where we start seeing some changes with Roberts. He goes on in his memoirs, and Williams and Parkin also echo it, that the merchant ship that was torpedoed was in the center of the convoy. It is true, she was in the center column, but she was tail end Charlie in that column, and row 4 to port is vacant. To say that the submarine had to have been inside the convoy to attack that ship is a forced argument. I can show you 2 examples right here. Within range and aspect requirements of German U-boat tactics, I don't have to be inside the convoy at all. There's also an unspoken assumption that Enivor was the intended target. I think you can make a very strong argument that U-567, which was the U-boat of Gilbert Andras, who at the time was the leading ace following the capture of Kretschmer and the loss of Prien and Shepka, that he could have shot at Largo with a 3-weapon salvo and just missed. This happened a lot with convoy actions. The ship that was shot at was missed, and somebody in the next column over caught a torpedo, because once you shoot a straight runner, it's addressed to whom it may concern. We also see a very strange claim by Roberts that Williams is very explicit, and Parkin is pretty hard too, that said Buttercup, when executed, was successful, but it was a fluke. They didn't catch the attacking U-boat, they caught another member. The problem is the Admiralty report is very clear. No U-boat was detected, let alone attacked, following the immediate torpedoing of Enivor. Robert I don't know what ship he's referring to. Walker basically recognizes his error, calls off Buttercup, and everybody comes back in. 2 hours later, U-567 is caught again coming in from the port side by the sloop Deptford and is forced to dive because the star shell goes over right on top of her. And Deptford executes several attacks. After the last one, she's trying to reacquire. 8 minutes later, there's 2 loud explosions, and they're along the bearing to where they thought the U-boat was. And but there was no wreckage, so that's why Walker only called it a probable. In fact, it was Engelbert Andras's 567 was sunk, and Dunetz lost his leading ace again. So let's talk about how Roberts built his argument. In both Williams and Parkin, Roberts is noted to saying that the escort screen would be some 5,000 yards away from the convoy. Well, that's true if you were a battle fleet destroyer, which Roberts was, and you were in the intermediate screen. Because it's the intermediate screen, and this example is from the ASW manual of 1939, that you have to fill the torpedo danger zone. Now, what that is that to be able to attack successfully. A torpedo must be launched within the zone. Now, for an electric torpedo, a G7E T2, that's 5,000 yards. The weapon's range is 5,400, but remember, you're not just shooting downrange, you're doing torpedo run, which tends to be longer, so you have to be inside the zone. The intermediate zone of destroyers on the battle fleet fills the torpedo danger zone. That's what Roberts knew. That's what he understood. From that, he makes the assumption you could not possibly attack a U-boat from outside the destroyer screen, which is what he was told escort commanders were informed that they should be expecting. There's just one problem with Roberts' assumption. It's not tactical guidance for convoys. The escort positions and their distance from the convoy body is not 5,000 yards. Even in the Atlantic convoy instructions in 1942, it varies between 2,000 and 4,000, with 4,000 being directly ahead, like these units here. All the ones on the side are 3,000 yards. Now, if you're lucky and you've got enough escorts, you can park another one out on the beam at 4,000 yards, but that was very rare. And your stern guy is at 2,000 yards. In Malcolm Llewellyn Jones' book on the Royal Navy and Anti-Submarine Warfare 1917 to 1949 book, he makes it clear that in the earlier stages, the distances were 2,000 to 3,000 yards away. And in the 1939 ASW manual, the convoy distances are 1,500 yards. So we're well inside the 5,000 yards that Roberts is assuming. On top of that, these are base ranges. These escorts are zigzagging. By doctrine, they're supposed to be altering their range by plus or minus 500 yards. So you're talking an escort is between 2,500 to 3,500 yards on a beam. Now, it's dark. You're doing dead reckoning. It was recognized that this distance could actually go as high as 1,000 yards on either side. So what we have is Roberts' assumption of the escort distance does not match what Walker did for Convoy HG-76. On top of that, the U-boat tactical guidance called for attacks to occur between 1,500 and 3,000 meters. You know, you're talking 1,600 to 3,200 some odd yards. And according to Jürgen Rauer and Llewellyn Jones, the actual attack range tended to be closer to the 3,000 meter. When you compare these two distances, it is entirely possible, in fact, it's even likely, that an attack would happen from outside an escort screen. And the Germans agree. Kretschmer in particular is very aggravated by his fellow U-boat commanders who are using what he called orthodox tactics, shooting outside the screen. Gunther Hessler, when he wrote the report for the Royal Navy, made it quite clear that depending upon where the escort screen was, it was not unusual to be attacking from outside. Basically, these 2 points completely destroy Roberts' argument. He's made a straw man argument to try and justify his belief that convoys, as a rule, were being penetrated. So if you look at the 3 assumptions that Roberts gives for his U-boat tactics, is a U-boat will slip into the convoy on the surface and attack from within. It will infiltrate from astern because if you cut across, well, that's not very seaman-like. Roberts has a really bad habit of quickly getting rid of other options because in this particular case, that's exactly what Otto Kretschmer did. And lastly, after an attack, a U-boat would immediately submerge and then wait for the convoy to pass over. So let's look at these. Penetrating a convoy was possible. It had been known that that was a possibility since 1917 in the ASW manual that the Brits published. We also know that it was almost verbatim in the 1934 mercantile convoy instructions. So getting into a convoy was not something that was considered impossible. But each time it was, say, a daring and experienced commander could. Well, if we look at what the Germans say, it's very interesting. Kretschmer, after the September 1940 HX-72 convoy, that was the second convoy that he ran into it. He wrote his standing orders for his watch officers, in which he specifically stated that we have to get close. You have to be inside the escort screen and at times in the convoy lanes. What Kretschmer was trying to push is that we want to get close enough where we can kill one ship with one torpedo instead of shooting three. And the reason why he was pushing this is because a Type 7 U-boat only had 14 torpedoes, and 2 of them were outside. You had to surface and pull them out and get him into the torpedo room. Now, Jürgen Rauer, in his Critical Convoy Battles of March 1943, addresses this topic, and he basically calls out that Kretschmer was one of the few to do this, and that even with some of his followers later on, penetrating the convoy seldom occurred. Now, from the Royal Navy perspective, in January 1941, the ASW division put out their monthly report where they stated that from their observation of the last several convoy battles, that few U-boats were prepared to penetrate a well-formed convoy. Now, this is January 1941. Basically, at this point, approximately 3 convoys had been penetrated, all by the same guy, Otto Kretschmer. What this tells us is that convoy penetration is the exception, not the rule. Infiltrating from astern was a little bit bizarre because this assumption is not included in Parkin's book. It is only in Williams. And if we look at German tactics as described, it's very clear they want to come in from the flank. If you look at Otto Kretschmer's approaches of the 4 convoys that he did his little dazzling through the innards, all 4 of them were penetrated from a flank. On the last one, the last convoy, he did a re-attack from astern. So what this tells us is, again, infiltrating from the stern is the exception, not the rule. Now, for submerging after attack, this is verboten. The U-boat aces knew that if you submerged, the U-boat lost its mobility advantage, it lost its ability to conduct attacks, and it was more susceptible to ASDIC detection and counterattack. This is the exact same thing Walker and the other Royal Navy specialists have been saying for years. Kretschmer went so far as to say in his standing orders that a U-boat was not to submerge under anything but the most desperate of circumstances. Now, all of Kretschmer's discussions that he put in, he did brief to Rader, he did brief to Dunitz, and the vast majority got folded into the U-boat Commander's Handbook. The one notable exception was penetrating into the convoy. That was not included. So if we look at this, we look at Robert's analysis of HG-76 as described in the biographies. If we look at his assumptions of German tactics on what he was assuming, if he had actually presented these points and had shown the raspberry that Williams had said, I have little doubt that Roberts would have been thrown out on his ear as a bloody idiot, and Watteau may not even have existed. Percy Noble knew very well what happened in HG-76. He would have spotted the errors of omission and commission. He was in very close contact with George Cressy, the head of the Anti-Submarine Division, and he would have recognized what Roberts was projecting as, how do you do this? And also, by the way, unsupported by HG76. And if he would have provided that raspberry maneuver, I can think of nothing more that would have been more offensive to Sir Percy Noble's sensitivities. Remember, he got on Walker's case for putting a number of escorts onto a single side. He didn't like that. What do you think he would think of a maneuver where most of the escorts are focused to a single side, in this case, astern? No, that wouldn't work. Now, we know by all accounts that Gilbert Roberts was, and I'm talking about everybody who wrote about it, including Walker advocates, that Gilbert Roberts was intelligent, motivated, possibly touchy individual. There is no way he could have made such egregious mistakes. Not a chance. What this suggests to us is that the events described in the biographies, based on the memoirs, is not what happened. And we have two really good pieces of information to support this. One, Watu not only survived, it thrived. And two, we know what Operation Raspberry was published in the Atlantic Convoy instructions. Okay. Here's the two Raspberry maneuvers as shown in Williams and Parkin. And again, getting back to Sally Davis's presentation in November, she's pointed this out to us. This is what caught my attention when I read Parkin's book, because I knew this wasn't the Raspberry that everyone had been talking about. This diagram, by the way, Parkin attributes to Vice Admiral Usborne. We'll talk about him in a minute. When it was given a lecture to him or a presentation in April 1942. This is what it looks like in the Atlantic Convoy instructions. The diagram to the right is the universal position for escorts. I have circled the 6 for the Night Escort 6 operation in red. You'll notice they're at 5,000 yards from the convoy. If we look at the actual operation itself, if we look at its various bits and pieces, it starts out with an inward search. Well, I know Roberts really likes to talk about inward versus outward searching. He has to turn inward. He's 2,000 yards further out. This is making a virtue of a necessity. So the inward turn is largely an ASDIC search that goes on to within 1,500 yards of the convoy. Then the escorts turn starkly away and they conduct dedicated visual search with star shells and with radar. And I'm certain ASDIC is also going on as well. Only one escort goes into the convoy, and that's after it does a sweep astern. This maneuver focuses on a U-boat threat external to the convoy, not internal. You'll also note there's a great deal of similarities between Raspberry and Buttercup. The inner search is ASDIC. The outer search is visual and it's radar. What I'm telling you is that Raspberry is essentially a modification of Buttercup. The only differences between these two is that in Raspberry, the escorts are further away, therefore they must turn in and they conduct the ASDIC search first. It is also a full convoy perimeter response, not a focused attack or a focused counterattack on one side. Now, is there any data, anything we can point to that suggests that this is true, that, that this is Raspberry just a modification? First, we have the function of Raspberry, and I have a copy of it down there at the bottom, which is to force a U-boat to dive by illuminance to make it more possible to be detected by ASDIC. And at the same time, to conduct a search visually and with radar in case it doesn't. This is Buttercup. This is exactly the way Walker described it. We also have two biographers of Walker, Terence Robertson and Commander David Wymas. Robertson was a hostilities-only naval officer who served in convoys, and he wrote both Walker's and Otto Kretschmer's biographies. If you really want to get a good feeling of the two best operators in both navies, read them back to back. It's a phenomenal reading. In Terence Robertson's book, he talks about a clash in the Derby House over Buttercup. And he specifically points out that Sir Percy Noble had problems with part of it and required Walker to make changes. Well, we know what those changes are. They're the ones that make it a full perimeter response, and any officer can call it, not just the senior officer. That's Raspberry. That is the basis of Raspberry. Now, when you get to David Wymas, he's explicit. He said that Buttercup had some defects, but it was the forerunner of a series of operations that were worked out in the tactical school in Derby House. They were then passed on, and it was the fruit operations. Wymas and Robertson were both convoy officers. They were knowledgeable, they had experience. When they say, or they allude strongly that Raspberry and Buttercup are related, I can believe it. So what kind of a timeline do we actually have here? If what's in Robert's memoirs that's reproduced in Williams and Parkin, if that didn't happen, what happened? Here's a plausible timeline for your consideration. On the 29th to 30th of December 1941, Walker's bringing in HMS Stork, who's got a dinged-in bow and a dinged-in stern, is coming into Plymouth for repairs. Before he even docks, he has a message from Admiral Sir Percy Noble saying, "We're going to London for a meeting on the 6th of January." On the 6th of January, there's a meeting with senior ASW officials. While Usborne is not mentioned as being there, it is undeniable that he was, because he was the aide to the Prime Minister on overseeing anti-submarine warfare developments. He was there. Robertson says that the meeting got contentious, that there was some disagreements over some of Walker's tactics. In particular, the lunging of sending escorts out to attack U-boats far from the convoy did not go over well, even though Walker sank U-131 and 434 with such maneuvers, and would do so again in later convoy actions. I believe after this meeting, that is when Roberts got his phone call to come to London. Now, Parkin says that Roberts got the phone call on the 1st of January. I don't see how that's possible. The reports that Walker, that the Commodore of the escort, the Commodore of the convoy and the escort ships could get all the reports in, vetted by Noble, signed off and sent up in 3 days, I think is a bit hard to do. By the 6th, I think that's entirely possible. Williams says Roberts got his phone call in the first week of January. I can buy that. So on, say, around the 6th to 7th is when Roberts gets his invitation. He comes up to see the Second Sea Lord, and right there is Vice Admiral Usborne, who wants Roberts to put together a team to do tactical analysis. They'll be staged out of Derby House. And then, according to Parkin, very explicitly, Usborne wanted Roberts to prove that Buttercup was utterly ineffective. When you hear prove and wargaming in the same sentence, fear but the worst of times. So soon thereafter, Roberts reports to Percy Noble, and it's a cool reception. Well, it's within a day or two of a contentious meeting, And now I have a retired vice admiral. Yeah, he's a primary aide to the prime minister who's telling me, a serving admiral, how to run my command. That doesn't go over well in anybody's Navy. So yes, Roberts got a cool reception. In early January, you have Roberts beginning his research, gathering convoy actions, assembling the WATU teams, the Wrens, the others, getting them trained. He interviews Walker, gets an idea of how Buttercup works, and after he sits down and analyze it, it's my belief that Roberts realizes he's in the middle of a political minefield. He is between two admirals who are very much in disagreement, who both have a big say in his future duties. It is extremely difficult to serve two masters, particularly when those masters are demanding and want it their way. I believe what Roberts saw was an opportunity to make this work by taking Buttercup, changing it enough so that Usborne would recognize it was a new maneuver, but at the same time addressing Noble's big criticism that he saw in Buttercup of being a focused, one-sided response. So let's wrap this up by saying, if this maneuver was not Buttercup, what is it? Well, according to the Atlantic Convoy instructions, it's Artichoke. It is a counterattack against a submerged U-boat that attacked during daylight hours. So, Roberts' contributions to the Battle of the Atlantic have been embellished, largely by himself. And we see this in the memoir data that gets into Parkins and Williams' book. This is what leads me to believe that Roberts wrote his memoirs much later in life, when age and a very chronic illness basically affected his memory. I also believe that his bruised sense of self-worth came to the fore, because Roberts is very clear in his memoirs that he did more than anybody else to win the Battle of the Atlantic. The Royal Navy did not agree with that. And in 1950, they issued a communique on the 5th anniversary where they explicitly named who that was. And it was Captain Frederick J. Walker. In David Wymas's book, Sir Max Horton basically says that in 1948. This undoubtedly wounded Roberts quite a bit. So it is difficult to take what is in Williams and Parkins' book as being the actual events. What we do know is that Watu was extremely effective trainer of escort commanders. At least 5,000, maybe more, were trained on the basic procedures that they would need to learn how to execute in their practical training. Theory to practice is a big thing with the U.S. Navy. I think it's also a big thing with the Royal Navy. Now, Watu's initial tactical developments were not particularly innovative. If you accept the argument that Buttercup and Raspberry are pretty much kissing cousins, then that holds. But as Watu trained and its graduates went to sea and came back with their experiences, you develop an incredible communication hub that was well-tuned. And it really came up and pushed new ideas, new developments, and that's when they became a real tactical development powerhouse. A point I need to bring up is that Roberts and the Wrens and the others were experts at the ASW game. They were not ASW experts. The tactical table is a very benign environment, but it's a good place to start. The Roberts biographies, they've got a lot of holes in them. They do not match up with historical documentation. And Operation Buttercup was effective as a submarine maneuver. It certainly wasn't perfect. And if you screwed up calling it the wrong side, it was completely ineffective. But if you called the right side, it was probably more effective than Raspberry. And Operation Raspberry, in my belief, is a modification of Buttercup. largely designed to allow Roberts to wingle his way through that minefield. Unfortunately, the Raspberry variants only had a relatively short life. They were canceled in May 1943 by the Third Amendment, authored by or signed by Sir Max Horton. So in looking at wargaming, these are things worth repeating. War games don't prove anything. If people start saying war games prove something, it's a misuse. You need to be aware of malign gaming. If you haven't seen Stephen Downes Martin's George Washington University presentation in August 2021, you really do need to go back and look at it. When a guy who is completely in control of your destiny tells you he has a result he wants you to prove, this is malign gaming, and it needs to be avoided. Another big lesson is that historical analysis cannot be based on a single source. It is not wise. And in that regard, Watu's story needs more points of view than Roberts. And you need to include the other guy because your enemy has a vote. But what I think the Watu story really shows is that an integrated analysis gaming operations cycle can be hugely impressive in its effectiveness, because by itself, the tactical table is insufficient. The environment is benign. You have to make many simplifications just to be able to play a game in a reasonable amount of time. And a lot of these simplifications just don't match reality. But if you can take the game, analyze conclusions, send it out, get feedback from the operating forces, now you have a really strong capability to solve problems. And let me wrap it up with, I have been looking for a copy of the Watu Tactical Game Rules for years. I know at least 3 other people that have been doing so, and it's been proving to be quite elusive. However, Larry Bond and I, with the Admiralty Trilogy Group, believe we have enough information that we can reconstruct the game. The basis will be the Royal Navy War Game Rules of 1929. And despite what we see in the biographies, Roberts did not use a Jane's game. The Royal Navy had not used a Jane's naval war game since 1900. John Curry has a wonderful book coming out, hopefully soon, that will describe all of the different types of games used by the Royal Navy from 1900 to 1915. John has already published the 1921 rules, and I have a copy of the 1929 rules. And we see significant, interesting similarities between the Watu game and the 1929 rules. I also have a copy of a Royal Navy document called Capabilities of Own and Enemy Forces for Use in Anti-Submarine Tactical Games, 1948. I believe this is the data format and some of the modeling that Gene Laidlaw may have done for the earlier Watu games. The Royal Navy is really good at bureaucratic inertia. If it works, they don't change it. And if this assumption that this is similar to what Ren Officer Laidlaw put together, then we have a pretty good idea of how to build the data tables and the modeling that they used for those games. We also have an app developer. His name's Kevin Martell, and he's already put together for us a Convoy model that we can run in our sim plot that we use mostly for Harpoon, but for other things. And basically, it does the same sort of thing that was done in the Watu tactical floor. Is you have a square rectangle and you move it based on what the Commodore did. And you can keep track of the time checks, of the maneuvers, the positions, and we can even do it in Watu colors if you'd like. It is our hope we will be able to present this game at next year's Connections Online. And just to let you know, that's all the stuff I use for this particular presentation. So at this point, I'll go back over to Chris Weave and we can open this up for questions.
Okay, sounds good. First thing is, Chris, you should send me those references, and I'll put them in the description here, so that everybody can see them.
I'll just send you the PDF with the brief. How's that?
Yeah, that sounds good. Send me the latest version of that. So the first question we have is from a known reprobate. So Tim is one of the usual suspects. It does not surprise anyone who is a Connections attendee that Tim is the first out of the gate with a question. So there's Tim's question. Thoughts?
I can't say about Buttercup, Tim. We do know Walker was a specialist in ASW. We know his last job before he went back to sea was to help run some of the experimentation. So maybe it's possible that could have been done. I would say Raspberry is a fleet to floor approach because Buttercup had been demonstrated operationally, and Roberts and the Wrens and the other staff members ran it on the table a couple of times to develop Raspberry from it. Now, it's not iterative. They only have one go around the cycle, but I believe there was a fleet to floor approach for Raspberry.
Helps to unmute. Okay, that sounds good. So there was a few things that actually came up while I was thinking about this. First of all, it's probably worth everybody reminding themselves that that nice drawing of the convoy that Chris showed you was not to scale. That showed the relative positions of those ships, but it didn't have an accurate representation of the distances between them. I'm sure all the naval officers, when they saw all those ships bunched up like that, immediately started cringing, because that's just that's a Starship Troopers, everybody runs into each other in orbit kind of formation. So, and the other thing is that I think is worth pointing out is that when all of this is taking place, we've got a lot of benefit of hindsight in that we know what the German doctrine is now, right? Like when Roberts made the assumption that they were angled down, right? I remember you saying something about that.
Trimmed down.
Trimmed down.
Roberts never made that assumption. That was a Walker assumption.
That was a Walker assumption. Okay, so Walker makes the assumption they're trimmed down. That's not a good assumption. And the reason why we know that that's not a good assumption is because we, have the captured German documents where they said, don't do that. The boat's not stable if you do that. And we have all the stuff that we pulled together after the war. That wasn't necessarily a bad assumption during the war. It's a bad assumption. We know that it was an incorrect assumption, but it wasn't an unreasonable assumption.
It wasn't unreasonable because the Brits did it in their exercises in the 1920s and 1930s, and they did it to reduce the visual detection capability of the escorts. Now, Gunther Hessler, in the Royal Navy report he did after the war, said, we just didn't do that. Au contraire, Kretschmer did it. And with a Type 7 U-boat, it's really risky. With a Type 9, the way it's built, it's downright dangerous. Yeah.
And so, and the other thing that always sort of strikes me about these things, and for those of you who are out there, Chris and I have talked about this, half dozen times? I'm not saying anything right now that Chris and I haven't talked about a bunch, right? So, but it's worth sharing with everybody else. When we sort of sit back and we look at World War II and we sort of go through all this stuff, it's relatively easy for us to keep track of it from the standpoint that we sort of know where things ended up, and it's just a matter of sort of getting stuff on the timeline correct, etc. We're not sort of doing it in real time. And it's all in the distant past. And so it doesn't have the sort of like day-to-day change in thinking, right? You're not thinking through the problem in real time in the same way that the people who lived it were. And this is if you go back and you read about the battles in the Pacific in particular, you've got situations where, you're fighting guys each month and you're rewriting your tactical doctrine in between battles. You may be rewriting your tactical doctrine on a weekly basis. The composition of the carrier air wings that fought at Coral Sea was not the same as the composition of the carrier air wings that fought 1 month later at Midway, because they said, oh, they did, in a month, they did a lessons learned. They figured out what changes they should make. They wrote up the changes and they implemented them by putting different airplanes on the ships. And so it's really kind of, a big part of the job of the people that were living it is just to figure out what was going on. It's kind of easier for us to go back because we've got the advantage that we can read everybody's meeting minutes, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have to rely on somebody saying like, yeah, I was at the meeting and I think this is what they said.
Well, remember, the Brits were reading the minutes. They knew where the Germans were going with a lot of these things. They knew about the acoustic homing torpedo, the T5.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Before it came out. They knew pattern runners were being worked on. In fact, just to highlight your point, when the Germans came out with the Feder Apparat torpedo, the FAT torpedo, that was the death knell for Raspberry, because the Germans were going to get inside the convoy, but it was the torpedo that was doing it, not the U-boat. And they were going to be able to shoot further out. And initially, the FAT torpedo was also not an electric. It was the steam torpedo, and that had a whole hell of a lot more range, and it was at the same speed.
Tactics change because the situation changes, not just because you're getting better at dealing with a static problem. So there's a tank show that sometimes shows up on the History Channel, where I remember in the early battles, they'll talk about the Sherman tank and its powerful 75 millimeter gun. And then in the late war battles, they talk about the Sherman tank and its wimpy 75 millimeter gun.
Yeah. It's because it didn't change.
Yeah. So, what works now doesn't necessarily work even 6 months later, let alone several years later. So, what was the single thing that surprised you the most when doing your research for this?
It was the discontinuity in the Roberts biographies and the analysis of the convoy. I've got parts of Walker's official report. They didn't even look the same.
Yeah.
And, that's what really set in my mind that maybe Roberts wrote these many years later when, and having tuberculosis for that long, it's not kind to the human body, let alone the mind. And he was somewhat wounded.
Well, and the Williams book came out in 73, 74?
74.
74. Okay. So, and when was Walker born? Or not Walker. When was Roberts born?
That was like, what, 1900?
Yeah. So, okay. So he's like 70. So we don't know exactly when he wrote that manuscript.
No, we don't.
And we've never seen that manuscript. Other people have, but you and I haven't.
I've only seen reference to 3 people actually seeing it.
Yeah. And where, Chris and I have been talking about this for a couple of weeks, and there's lots of tea reading here. Like, oh, he calls it a manuscript. That sort of implies that it's like it's something that's finished. Well, okay, maybe. But what we've got are other people's interpretations, at least 2 of whom are non-experts in the field, other people's interpretations of a book that a guy wrote, where we don't have all of the particulars of the book. Like, I don't think anybody's ever said when he wrote it. And so the book is published when he's like 74 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And so for all we know, the war ended in 45. When it ends in 45, at that point, you might mostly be able to keep straight what happened at what week during the war, if it's something particularly significant. But fast forward 25 years, if you're writing your memoir 25 years later, and, a lot of what he's doing is top secret. So I hope he didn't have a whole box of documents to reference. So he's probably doing a lot of it from memory, or whatever diary he had. And as a usual, I think it's usually the policy. I mean, I know that the Wrens were told don't keep a diary.
Yeah. Well, we now know that one did.
Yeah, one of them did, but you're always told to not keep a diary because a diary is potentially something that could fall in the wrong hands.
Well, if you take the 25-year rule, Williams should have been fine.
He should have
been fine.
In being able to talk about it or get the documents?
To get the documents.
But do we know that he did? We don't.
No. In fact, Parkin is the only one I know that got some. He's got enough to be able to get that true version of Raspberry. And I mean, I've accumulated documents over the years, like the Atlantic Convoy instructions I've had for 2 years. Same thing with the analysis of U-boat operations. I've had that for a year. Some of the Convoy HD 76 stuff. I mean, a lot of the diagrams and clips of text that I've done, you can see where they came from. And a lot of these, to my knowledge, this presentation is the first time you've seen some of this stuff since it was written.
Could be. I mean,
definitely Buttercup. I have every description of Buttercup is pale in comparison to what Walker actually designed.
Yeah. This is the thing that I sort of find most interesting about this is how this is a classic story of we're having to really figure out what the sourcing is on it, right? If this were an Intel product and we had to write the source summary statement, it would be a page long, just explaining the ins and outs of who did what when, et cetera. Mm-hmm. It's a complicated situation. And so what we know is that the common reports of this appear to be wrong. We've got some hypotheses as to why they're wrong. We can point to some ways in which they're wrong, but when push comes to shove, we can't say, oh, the issue here is that Roberts was a bitter old coot who wrote this when he was 69 years old and his memory's crappy. Well, we can hypothesize that at least some of that statement is true.
Well, and that's the big problem with Roberts' biographers. They're not naval officers.
Yeah.
They really don't have a good idea what's going on. By contrast, the 3 Walker biographers, every single last one of them was a Royal Naval officer in escort duty. Wymus was Walker's second in command of the 2nd Escort Group, and Alan Byrne was Starling's gunnery officer.
So, yeah, those fit in the category of that brings other potential sources of bias and stuff into it. But you, at the very least, they would understand the lingo and they'd be able to fit in the stuff that wasn't said.
Well, I think Wymus's approach, because he's got the strongest opinion between Buttercup and Raspberry. He's not whitewashing what's going on with Walker. He says, yeah, Buttercup had flaws, but it was good enough to get started. It was basically sound. And we see that not quite so strongly in Rear Admiral William Chalmers' book on Max Horton.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the problem that I have, is that everything that refers to personalities or events in Watu are all different from what Roberts said happened to what these other individuals said happened.
Yeah, that's actually really worth pointing out. Chris made the comment to me earlier this week or last week that, Buttercup versus raspberry is one of several topics he could have picked. It's not like he picked the one where the things don't match. He picked one of the ones where the things don't match.
In regard to your other question, Tim, I suspect the process by which raspberry was developed did formulate the other fruit tactics. Wymus is of the opinion it did. And the way you can look at it is all the other fruit tactics are coordinated multi-unit searching for a U-boat in some either submerged or surface condition. They're tailored towards day or night, but they are all coordinated, automatic type approaches, in which case, the basis from what Buttercup was trying to do does kind of go through all of them, but it gets really morphed when you get back to like Artichoke, or let's talk about Gooseberry, which was a shallow water approach. That's a little bit different. So I don't think there's quite the direct lineage to Buttercup as you can say with raspberry.
Okay. Let's see. Tim had one other one. So he's got an entire series of were these fleet to floor and back again cycles?
I would say in 1942-43 they were starting. They were if you read Sir Peter Gretton's book, besides the personal motivation to go back to the Watu group, he did often sit down and talk with Roberts and the others to relay what he had seen, what he talked about. Pineapple is referred to as a suggestion by another officer on an escort that Roberts ran with. They put it on the floor and ran with it and worked it out. Beta search is one that it's debated. Let's put it that way. If you look at the two diagrams, beta search is probably a little bit better than alpha search. It is not better than the gamma search, which is a multiple unit side-by-side sweep. And the gamma search really pretty much came out of Walker-based tactics. Although you could make the argument that that was something that had been learned earlier and was just being brought forth, and how to do the search. Not that you've got multiple units doing the search.
Okay. It's, it sort of highlights the fact that this is talking about the guy who won the war is really that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. You can maybe talk about who lost the war, but you can't really talk about who won it.
Well, I would also say it tends to be a kind of a Navy thing where you kind of point to people as being exemplars. The way the Royal Navy phrased their communique is that Walker, more than any other officer, did the most in defeating the U-boats.
Oh,
now, mind you, his group sank 28 U-boats. It's really hard to argue with success. I mean, they sank 20 when he was in command, and Wymus, when he took over, sank another 8.
And it's also worth pointing out, as Chris has pointed out to me, that Robert sort of felt like he wasn't duly recognized for his contribution, and he probably wasn't, but he was a shore guy, right? And this gets back to one of Sally Davis's biggest problems about why weren't some of the Wrens really recognized? And I know she thinks it's because it's their gender. I actually look at it, it's a more mundane thing. They're a supporting command. They're ashore.
The people who got the big awards in the Royal Navy were the pointy end of the spear. They went to sea, they fought great battles, and they did great things. Everything else behind it, you got a nice letter, thank you very much for your participation. And at best, the guy in charge got recognized. In that regard, Watu was treated no differently than the guys who did the maintenance, the people who did the logistics, the intelligence people.
Yeah.
I mean,
which is not to say that that was how it should be. It's just that's how it was in the Royal Navy at that time.
Yeah, and actually it was how it was in almost every Navy. If you compare the award process that we have now, most of the, I mean, there was no such thing as a Navy Achievement Award back in World War II. We've added so many things to try and do that recognition thing, which is actually very important to people. Some people, that's how they, that's how they define their contribution. It's what motivates them to do work as well as they can. And it was rather crude back in World War II. There, you either, got a Navy Cross or not much.
So we got one question left, and it's perhaps the most important question that anyone has ever asked on this topic. I think we all know the answer to that, don't we, Chris?
Oh. Thank you, Mr. McGuire. I would have to say I know enough in what I've been able to collect and put together to say the story is not right. I would have to do a lot more work to get the archival material in. I got to get a hold of Roberts's memoir. I'm trying to track down an option because there's supposedly a copy on this side of the Atlantic. I just don't know where it is.
Well,
but Dr. William Glover, when he wrote his training chapter in the 1994 book on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Atlantic Conference, he explicitly cites a photocopy of a manuscript. He uses MSS in his citation. I just can't find out where it is. But I'd have to get that, and I'd have to get a lot more information to be able to pull all this together in a coherent fashion, rather than just point out, hey, I have enough to say that this story is screwed up.
Okay. Well, I and I think everybody else who's been listening to us strongly encourages you to do that. You should talk with, there are other people that you could potentially work with that we've talked about. And it just occurred to me that I don't think in any of our conversations I used the word Kickstarter.
Oh, dear.
If the issue with the other person we talked about is an advance, then hey, Kickstarter.
Yeah, there's that option.
So it makes sense to me. All right, so I think let's go ahead and call it. I think we've culminated.
Sounds fine.
I would like to thank Chris very much for coming and participating in this, and I suspect that this isn't the last time we've heard anything about Watu. Like I said, it is such a sort of wonderful story about the impact of wargaming. There's so much opportunity to tell more about that story. And with that in mind, I think it would be great to I could see this being an annual event at Connections Online, somebody doing a presentation on Watu.
Oh, boy.
Great wargaming story. And so Rex Brynan says that's probably a good thing to think about.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that was already on the list. Well, with that in mind, everybody, thank you very much for attending this session of Connections Online. Thanks to Chris for giving this incredibly well-researched presentation. I know for a fact that he could have done this as a 4-hour presentation. because I talked him out of that.
You and Stephen Downs Martin.
Yes. Because how long is this version?
I think it's 23 slides, not counting the title and the references.
Yeah, and the first version was 53, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So, but thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you all tomorrow.